In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Very nice to be with you here, and we are continuing our Explore God series on Veracity Hill, where we are dealing with life's biggest questions. Last week, our guest was Dr. Doug Groothuis, and we talked about whether life has a purpose and how, in reflecting upon some of the most popular statements or sentences in philosophy in Western history, we can discover that humans do indeed have a purpose in life. And on today's episode, we are talking about, is there a God? It's one of those questions that many people find themselves asking. They have doubts. They're seeking God. And for some others, it just seems quite obvious that God exists, and it's not really much of a intellectual burden for them. And before kicking off to our guest, who is going to really enlighten us on the aspects of the concerns that people have and how we should be thinking about these sorts of questions, I do want to play a 2.5-minute clip, very well-made video put out by the folks at Explore God, and it will help us to sort of get a pulse for what people think about whether God exists and what we should think about that. So without further ado, here we go.
Let me put it this way, I'd like to think that God is real, for one reason or the other.
I don't believe in God because the idea that an omniscient, loving being would judge me, who is mortal and ignorant and tiny, for all eternity based on a few years' experience, I find to be rather a cruel thought.
Look at everything around us, from the universe to our being to the ability to have consciousness. I think that it can only be explained by God.
All the power that God has, he, she, it has given to me. So we're definitely one.
I hope there's something else out there. It'd be fun to experience whatever God has in store next. Either that or we're all just evolved apes.
There's so many things where it's just like that couldn't have just happened. Like, that has to have something behind it, and I believe that something's God.
For all we know, there could be aliens out there. I have no idea, to be honest.
I was raised atheist. I don't believe in a higher power, but, you know, I also don't claim to know everything about the world, and I think maybe it's a bit arrogant for people to try and believe they know the truth to anything.
For me, yes, it's obvious. There are like so many things. For me personally, so many things that I've been through, and after that, I'm like, oh, that had to be God.
The pat answer is that how can there be no God when there's all this beauty around us? But I think about evolution and science and all of that kind of thing and think, how can you not just accept it the way it is?
Really don't know what to believe, to be quite honest, so it's kind of just really just living it day by day and just trying to be a really good person.
I don't know if there is one. I just pretend, I guess, and hope that there's something else out there.
All right, so there you have it, a variety of perspectives on whether or not God exists. And as you can see, those different perspectives, people came at it from all sorts of different angles. They were thinking about, say, evolution or beauty or morality, or the one gal at the end there said she's kind of pretends like God exists and just hopes there is one. And so to help us think more through these issues, I've invited on our program today Dr. Tyler McNabb. He is the assistant professor of philosophy at Houston Baptist University. And Tyler, thank you for joining us on our program today.
Howdy. Thanks very much for having me. Looking forward to our discussion.
Yes. Now, just towards the end of last year, that is 2018, you were published by the Cambridge University Press, a book called Religious Epistemology. And religious epistemology, I know what religion is, so I know what religious is. Epistemology, though, that seems like a big term. What is epistemology?
Yeah. So I take epistemology to be the study of knowledge, justification, warrant, rationality. Specifically, it's the study of knowledge, but I take it's the study of these concepts as well. So the question about, like, is a belief rational, or can we know that God exists, or can we know that we're not being deceived and we're not just being tricked by an evil demon monster right now, but we're not in the brains in the matrix, what does it take in order for a belief to be rational? These sorts of questions are asked in the field of epistemology.
And yeah, there are all sorts of different questions in epistemology, but religious epistemology then deals with those ideas and beliefs about religion, right?
Yeah.
Typically, broadly speaking, more so than the nitty-gritty of, New Testament studies or something like that.
Yeah, so it kind of takes these concepts, these epistemic concepts, and relates them to religious belief and practice. And so if you like studying epistemological questions and you like studying religion, you put them together and you've got another sort of subfield within a subfield in philosophy called religious epistemology.
Now, I want to ask you a couple questions to start off, but I do want to get your thoughts on the video that we just played, that 2.5 minute video. But before maybe going too deep or surprising people with maybe how we should think about those sorts of questions, first let's get more the lay of the land about how at least Christians think about these things. So as Christians, we do believe that God exists. But how we come to that belief, or how we think we come to that belief, might vary. And so there are different Christian perspectives on this. And maybe you could tell us what are sort of the main views on how Christians come to the belief that God exists, if I'm phrasing that properly. And forgive me, Tyler's an analytic philosopher, so he's going to definitely correct me on my failure of nuancing things properly.
No. Yeah, so I think maybe what you're getting at, perhaps two questions. One is maybe in reference to how do we actually, what normally actually happens, why people believe in God, or how people come to believe in the supernatural, right? And then maybe there's another question in there, correct me if I'm wrong, in reference to what methodological approaches should we utilize in order to get people to believe in God? Is that sort of two questions? What you're asking?
Yes, because number one affects number two.
Yeah.
If humans are unable to say reason into belief in God, well, that's gonna affect that we try to, in a constructive manner, argue with people. So,
sure. Yeah.
And there are different Christian approaches to that.
That's right. So if I can tackle the first question first, and then engage the second question. So according to cognitive science of religion, the paradigm view, so people don't realize this. I mean, maybe you hear like mantras, right? Like, we're all born atheists, or you have to be indoctrinated in order to believe in God, right? Well, to quote our president, that's fake news. According to the field of cognitive science of religion, belief in God, the paradigm view is that belief in God, belief in the supernatural, belief in divinity, however you want to say it, is an evolutionary spandrel. evolutionary spandrel. That's to say, it's a byproduct of certain advantageous evolutionary factors, right, or beliefs. And the idea is that there's been different theories proposed, but probably the most popular theory is that we have what's called a hyper-agency detection device. And a hyper-agency detection device is this idea that we have some sort of mechanism that produces belief in agency even when agency is not there. So we've all had that feeling before where we're asleep, it's nighttime, right? And all of a sudden we wake up and we hear something, right? We hear like a creak in the night.
I mean,
and we
I'm hearing some creak right now. I don't know, is that maybe one of your office mates or...
Oh, perhaps. Yeah, so you hear something in the night and you project there's a person there, right, coming to get me. So you have to check maybe under the bed, in the closet, or open the door. So the idea is that we project teleology or purpose. We protect agency even when it's not there. And so there's this idea that you go and see the beautiful stars at night, right? Maybe you go and you see an ocean front and waves crashing against the rocks. And perhaps you might feel a sense of design. And you project agency upon this sort of natural phenomenon. And so this is one explanation for why people believe in God sort of in a natural way. There's been certain studies done where that have been replicated in China, Scandinavia, Canada, America, the UK, I believe, as well, where it seems like children are just at a natural disposition to believe in teleology. And so they've gone and asked, children of a certain age to explain certain natural phenomena, such as like, why are rocks pointy? And the children will say things like, so animals won't sit on them, right? And they have these sort of teleological explanations. When asked uneducated adults likewise preferred teleological explanations. And when asked scientifically educated adults, they didn't prefer teleology until they were asked to respond to these questions, such as like, why are rocks pointy, very quickly, without thinking, right? And they had much more preference to answers that were teleological in nature. So it does seem like there's some sort of mechanism or mechanisms within us that when we sort of get put in the right sort of environment, naturally produces in us belief about divinity, belief in the supernatural, belief about God. So I think lots of people believe in God because of this. But of course, this goes into the other question, right, about how we should approach apologetics or getting people who don't believe in God to believe in God. Mm. So I don't know if you want me to stop there, if you want me to keep going.
No, keep going. I'm really enjoying this.
All right. So, of course, you could think that most people come to believe in God in this way, but still think that people come to believe in God through arguments. So just because you think this is the origin for or explanation for why lots of people believe in God doesn't mean that it's the only way people can believe in God. There are arguments in a field called natural theology, right? Natural theology is this sort of field that studies what we can know about God, or if we can know that there is a God, without use of revelation. And so there's an approach in natural theology called, in apologetics rather, called classical apologetics. And classical apologetics, I take it, is the idea where you're going to use philosophical arguments to argue for God's existence. So you have maybe different cosmological arguments, different moral arguments, different arguments from design, teleology, and nature, consciousness, and so forth. And they're going to really want to concentrate on that. You have what's called evidentialists, which is different than, for those who are familiar with epistemology, it's a different sort of meaning of the term. Evidentialists, as it pertains to apologetics, is this idea that sort of the primary way in how we should go about arguing or convincing people that God exists is by way of evidence, specifically or especially through the way of like historical evidence, right? So think Mike Lacona's argument for the resurrection, or Gary Habermas's argument for the resurrection.
Mike Lacona, he's a good guy.
He is a good guy. Shout out to Mike.
He's your colleague there at Houston Baptist.
He is indeed. There's this other way called presuppositionalism. And this is sort of the most controversial approach in apologetics amongst those interested in apologetics. And the idea is sort of everyone, according to the presuppositionalists, begs the question to some degree, reasons in a circle. That's to say, you assume that which is in question, right, in order to get to your conclusion. And the presuppositionalist argues that the empiricists they assume their observation, or the rationalist assumes the reason. So Christians, we should just assume the Bible is true, and our duty now is to show others that they actually deep in their heart of hearts assume that the Christian worldview is true as well. They're suppressing the truth and unrighteousness, to reference Romans 1, and they go on to show why that's the case. And then there's an approach called Reformed epistemology. It's actually, Reformed epistemology technically is a philosophical thesis. It's a thesis that belief in God can be rational apart from argumentation. But it has somewhat been developed into an apologetical system. I mean, you can sort of see that a bit in Plantinga's the knowledge of God debate with Tooley. He sort of sets up an apologetic methodology, so to speak, in there. And then Kelly James Clark in 5 Views or 6 Views, one of the two, on apologetics. He sort of comes from a Reformed epistemology view. So Reformed epistemology, echoing back to John Calvin, Reformed, right? Because John Calvin talked about this faculty called the sensus divinitatis, the sense of the divine, of divinity. And similar to what cognitive science says, Calvin postulated that all human beings have a faculty that is aimed toward producing belief in God. And so Alvin Plantinga comes along and says, well, hey, if that faculty was functioning rightly and was aimed at truth, and the person was in the environment for which they were sort of designed to be in, and that faculty produced belief that God exists, then belief in God, his existence would be rational, even apart from argument, right? That's the Reformed epistemology thesis again, that belief in God can be rational apart from argument. And so, what is interesting about that, not only that it seems to correspond a little bit with what we were talking about earlier in cognitive science, but it would allow, if the Reformed epistemology thesis was true, for lots of people to be rational in the belief about God, not just the scholar, the PhD, the person who's super duper into apologetics, right? But also a person who has, I don't know, say a medieval farmer, right? We all have this faculty, and it's, at least in most people, it's working sufficiently, at least enough to produce theistic belief, at least at times. And so you can sort of develop an approach from this to handle apologetics. And of course, there's just sort of an eclectic view, which sort of sees good in all of these views and maybe utilizes each particular view given a specific context. So I think that's roughly, I think, to answer your first and second question.
Yeah. And, it's quite impressive that you're doing this all from the top of your mind, which is great. All right. So I've got a number of questions. So you talked about the medieval farmer. So here, what the Reformed epistemology view says is that the medieval farmer doesn't need to have a robust defense of his belief in God to illustrate or prove, if those are the right words, that his belief is rational and that he is warranted and justified in his belief that God exists. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so the medieval farmer, so to speak, doesn't need to know Aquinas' first 5 ways in order to be considered rational. Maybe his faculty is just functioning rightly, when he's out in nature doing whatever medieval farmers do, sees the starry skies, sees the beautiful landscape in the fields, the texture of the grass or the leaves, and all of a sudden he finds himself believing like God exists. He's not doing induction or abduction or deduction. He just looks at something and just all of a sudden finds himself with this belief. If that belief is the result of his faculties functioning rightly, right, the sensus divinitatis functioning rightly, then his belief would be rational, even if he wasn't able to, didn't have access, to arguments or something like that.
The first approach, or what you called maybe the natural way, or what cognitive science kind of tells us, it seems like sometimes the research in cognitive science is trying to be reductionistic. And that, well, if we could show how in the brain humans come to form a belief, which, by the way, I don't know how they would ever do that, because you're talking about material and immaterial things, then we could explain away God's existence. Now, maybe
I see.
Maybe there are some well-intended researchers, but this is all to say, when they provide the cognitive research here, without making any sort of philosophical bent one way or the other, even if we could explain how we come to that belief, that doesn't mean that it's wrong, does it?
Yeah, right. So we want to be wary of the genetic fallacy, one, right? You can't sort of say something's true or false merely based off the origins of the belief. So some actually do try to utilize this and develop a defeater, so to speak, for theistic belief. So people argue like, well, hey, if this is all that's there, and look at this hyperagency detection device. It detects errors all the time. Perhaps this is also what's responsible for us believing in ghosts and psychics and leprechauns, different gods, different religions. It's not a really reliable faculty. So if this is what's primarily leading you to believe that God exists, then maybe you shouldn't really trust the equipment there. Your hardwiring there. So you're not really rational. Upon reflection, maybe you were rational in believing that God exists, but once you find out all this information about cognitive science and how unreliable your hyperagency detection device is, you're no longer rational. So yeah, you can develop sort of arguments like that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. All right, so I'm curious now.
Which have good responses too, by the way.
Yes.
In fact, in religious epistemology, the volume you mentioned, I give 2 such responses there. So for the listeners there.
The debate on this is very wide and deep. Lots of literature out there, and even for the Christian approaches here, I mean, books upon books written on methodology. Definitely a lot, and we can certainly provide resources for that at our website. I want to get your take on the video that we played to start. There were a number of individuals, and to be honest, I don't know if they were just actors and actresses or if they were genuine interviews. But nevertheless, I thought that they represented not equivalency of population, but they represented the diversity of different views out there.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on some of the remarks the people made?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have I don't recall this completely verbatim, but it seemed like one woman who argued that we really can't know any important metaphysical or moral truths at all. So I think she first said that she was an atheist, but then kind of remained agnostic and skeptical that we could know anything, right? Or at least perhaps being charitable, maybe anything that's sort of an important metaphysical or moral truth, something like that. And so I guess responding to her, you could respond in several ways. One, if you're going to make the claim you can't know nothing at all, then that would be like, well, can you know that? Or if you can't know anything technical, well, that seems, maybe you're getting at something technical there, right? Or you can respond in that sort of way, like a self-defeating round. Or, of course, you could respond like this. This is how Ivan Plantinga responds, utilizing Reformed epistemology. If God exists and he's hardwired our faculties to produce belief about him, right? And we just find ourselves believing that God exists one day because of this faculty, and it's working rightly and so forth, then seems like we could know that God exists. So I don't know why we need to be so skeptical about knowing truths about God's existence. It's almost sort of like a Kantian sort of skepticism there. There was another interesting, I think it was one of the first persons, if not the first person. There was a lady who argued that she's I guess it was something like this. God is supposed to be all loving and powerful. She can't believe in a God, though, that would send people to hell for a few years of learning experience.
Right, yeah. A relative
finite abilities and so forth. So God doesn't exist because apparently he's supposed to be all loving, but also he's going to send us to hell if we get things wrong. And so I think roughly that's what she was articulating. And of course, you can break that down, right? I mean, you could discuss with this person that maybe you have a view that God's not going to damn someone who's completely ignorant, who's never heard the gospel, right? Who doesn't know better. But maybe they're responding to the light that God has given them in the best way that they can, right? Similar to Abraham before the gospel. It says that Abraham believed the gospel before obviously Jesus came, long before Jesus came. How did he believe the gospel? Well, he was trusting in the promises God was giving him. So, I mean, you don't have to necessarily even think that if someone's completely ignorant that they're going to be damned for all eternity, right? If God is, I think my colleague Jerry Wallace does this really well, and that's to articulate that if God is a maximally great being, which hopefully most theists would agree, then he's going to be optimally loving, optimally good, right? And so he's going to want to give optimal grace, not just enough grace to damn everyone, to justly damn everyone, right? But he's going to want to give as much grace as is required, right? Or that would sort of bring about faith, maximal, optimal grace there. So, I mean, the caricature that she depicts of God, and I mean, of course, that doesn't even show that God doesn't exist, right? It would, at best, it would show that, on her view, that
an evil God exists.
Is giving a reason why she personally doesn't want to follow God or something like that. Not that the cosmological argument or other arguments for God don't succeed.
Right. So on her view, for all she knows, there's an evil God, an evil almighty power that created the universe, and he's just a meanie, and she's not going to follow him.
Yeah, or perhaps an indifferent God, or maybe even like a God who's like more good than not, but still can be a jerk when it comes to not cutting people slack or not wanting to cut people slack.
Yeah, something like that. Well, Tyler, we've got to take a break here. When we come back, we'll explore more about some of these epistemologies and methodologies, I should say, really, about how we come to form our belief. And what are some good tactics for talking to people about God's existence? So stick with us through this short break from our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Let's say there's this Christian apologist. You love their message, but have trouble finding their videos, their articles, or social media posts. How do you stay connected to them? We're on it. Defenders Media uses the tools of the digital age to create content for your favorite apologists. We give them more screen time, more digital soapboxes, and more presence to deliver more of the content that you love. That's what we do.
I know that social media is important to those of you who follow my work. Many respond to my videos and posts on Facebook and Twitter, but it becomes impossible after a while to keep up with it all and to continue with research. That's why I'm thrilled that we have found a solution, Defenders Media.
Whether it's a website, whether it's printed material, whether it's a question on graphics, I cannot do what I do and reach my audience without the help of Defenders Media. They have been integral in helping me to reach my audience.
Defenders Media ensures consistent content reaches your hand from today's leading apologists and apologetic ministries, like Mike Lycona, Apologetics 315, the Veracity Hill Podcast with Kurt Jarris, and more.
To learn more, text the word Defenders to 555-888, and we'll send you a free PDF of the top 5 ways to share the gospel online. Thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. If you would like to learn how you can become a sponsor, you can go to our website, veracityhill.com, and click on that Patron tab to learn more. And patrons are folks that just chip in a few bucks each month, $5, $10, $20. Really helps us to continue to go and grow. And if you've just are tuning in to this program and you've missed the past couple weeks about that growing aspect, Veracity Hill is now a radio ministry. We are airing our program through the Wilkins Radio Network in Augusta, Georgia, AM 1050, Saturdays at noontime. And so if you live in the Augusta area, we are pleased that you're listening in to us, and happy to see that our ministry is growing. So if you want to help Veracity Hill reach other radio markets, please consider becoming one of our monthly contributors. Well, on today's program, we're talking about how we come to the belief that God exists and what some good methodologies might be for talking to people about the existence of God. And joining us on our program today is Dr. Tyler McNabb. He is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Houston Baptist University, and he is an analytic philosopher, that is someone who thinks very deeply about areas within philosophy, specifically religious epistemology and some other areas as well. And an analytic philosopher, Tyler, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is someone who cares deeply about, say, definitions and thinking through the argumentation and just being very fine and precise. And this is contrasted with what's called continental philosophy, which I read a bit of when I was doing a master's degree in theology over in England, actually. I read more continental thinkers and really, for me, writers. Their writing style was it was fluffier. It was harder to follow along with what they were trying to convey. Or maybe I'm painting with broad strokes here, Tyler. Is that a general description of the two different camps?
Yeah, so analytic philosophy, like you were saying, there's an emphasis on rigor, being very clear, precise, also a heavy emphasis on logic and what the sciences tell us, right? While an analytic philosophy mainly came about through the UK and America, right, sort of part of the world. And then continental philosophy, continental Europe, right, where the emphasis oftentimes is very different. In fact, one of the some continental philosophers seem to think that not being as clear as possible is a virtue, right? There's oftentimes different focus on questions such as more existential questions on meaning, purpose, being, that sort of thing.
Yeah, good. All right, before we jump back into our discussion, Tyler, and I'm not sure if you've watched our program before, but we do a segment of the show called Rapid Questions, where we ask fun questions, get to know a little bit more about you, and it's totally unrelated to our topic, but we get to know a bit more about you personally. So I'll pull up the game clock here. You won't hear it, but I'll start it and ask the first question. 60 seconds, and we'll see how many you can answer. So are you ready?
Okay. Yeah.
All right, here we go. What is your clothing store of choice?
H&M.
Taco Bell or KFC?
Ooh. Taco Bell, but reluctantly.
What song is playing on your radio these days?
Adele. Anything by Adele or Sam Smith. There you go.
Who's one person you'd like to have dinner with to discuss a topic you disagree on?
Probably some sort of ranking member in the Democrat Party and talk about abortion. That could be one thing.
Do you drink Dr. Pepper?
All the time.
Oh, beautiful. Pick a fictional character that you'd like to meet.
I would really like this one. You might stump me on. Captain America.
If you became a multi-millionaire overnight, what would you buy?
A house.
What type of music do you dislike the most?
Metal.
Metal, nice. My electrician Tony is going to disagree with you on that one. Very nice.
I actually had a philosopher before on Facebook defriend me because I attacked metal on
Is that
Facebook.
so? Fascinating.
And I know there's some really hardcore metal fans out there.
Yes, and some people, they can be very sensitive about who their Facebook friends are. Yeah. And that goes both ways. Like people that are hurt and they'll defriend someone, or people that are hurt because they've been unfriended. So
yeah.
That can go both ways. Fictional character Captain America. Why do you want to meet him?
Well, he just, to me, like, especially out of like superheroes, I mean, him and Superman, but I'm more of a Marvel person, and Captain America has more of an emphasis on like liberty and freedom and so forth. So there's a little bit of as a right-wing person, because some sort of conservative values, religion and conservatism, in which Captain America seems to represent. Seems like just like an honest guy, like a guy like Jon Snow. Jon Snow would be another guy I wouldn't mind hanging out with. Someone that's really kind of pure, and you want to follow them. Right?
Yeah, the idealism is something that's attractive to people.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, good. Well, I guess maybe before jumping in, let me ask you this. So, are you excited about the Marvel movies coming out this year?
Yeah. So I'm really excited for Endgame. Right.
Yep.
Really excited for that.
What do you think? So we got Captain Marvel, we've got Endgame, right? Avengers Endgame, and then you've got Spider-Man Homecoming. Yep. Those are the three coming out this year.
Endgame, I'm looking forward to most. I'm really afraid that Captain America's going to die. But if he does, I really hope he goes out like in a way that saves the world, sacrificing himself, kind of like Jesus.
I don't think you mean Captain America dies. I think you mean Steve Rogers.
Yes.
The mantle will continue on.
To be analytical, yeah, more precise. Honestly, Captain Marvel, like, I don't know. The trailer so far, I was pretty excited about it. Trailers so far haven't really moved me. Spider-Man, I think the actor, is it Tom Holland? Something.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's doing an amazing job with the role. So and it's in Europe. So it's going to be quite fun to watch.
Last question about Marvel here, because I'm interested. I see the movies. Endgame, how do you think... I think, because obviously Spider-Man has to come back. Spoiler alert to people that haven't seen Infinity War yet. Okay. Sorry, Chris. My tech producer's like, you haven't seen it. All right, so he's got to come back. So,
snap.
Oh, funny. So what's your theory on it? The Time Stone, I've read articles, maybe you have too. Like, is there something with Doctor Strange giving the Time Stone, which was already lit up when he gives it to Thanos? And there's Ant-Man, and what do you think?
I think the quantum realm's probably going to be some bit of it, since, again, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Ant-Man 2, close your ears.
Yeah. But
with Ant-Man stuck in sort of the quantum realm, so to speak, and he somehow gets out, right? Because that was the whole thing. Like his maybe future mother-in-law, something like that, got stuck, right, and couldn't just get out. So if he could figure out how to get out by himself, maybe there could be some sort of time travel with that.
Yeah, nice. Well, I'm very much looking forward to having Endgame come out. And, of course, I'll be there. Captain Marvel comes out first, so I'll be there at the theater. Because they're going to drop some Easter egg and, some hint about what's coming. So, all right, good. Well, this is not a show on Marvel, but always great to chat about these things. We are talking about the belief in God and whether it's rational, and how Christians can be rational in their faith. And sometimes it's not always about having reasons and having well-deduced arguments for one's belief in God, but maybe sometimes it just comes down to, hey, it's a belief that comes very natural or basic to me. I look at the starry heavens and I think there's a creator. It's a properly basic belief, as Tyler here would be sympathetic to that view. So if and this is going to take off from the first half of the program, you were talking about the perspectives in that video that we had. And there are some people that they have these doubts and they just don't believe God exists. If on your view, you say if God exists, then we can be rational. But how do we really know that God exists? I mean, why should we think that God exists then? And if we're doing that, are we taking one of the other different approaches?
Very good. So there's this principle in epistemology called KK theory, which says that in order to know something, you have to know that you know. Can you hear me? It looks like you froze up.
Yeah, no. KK theory. Yep.
Yep. And this, to me, doesn't seem very plausible. So, for example, it seems to me that animals and young infants and young children have knowledge, and yet they don't know that they know, right? Whenever you get a tennis ball in front of a dog, and the dog has forms of belief that there's a ball in front of them, right? Or if you tell the dog, who's a good boy, maybe the dog forms the belief that I'm a good boy, right? Joking aside, but
yeah. You're clearly not a Calvinist. You're not a Calvinist because dogs even know that.
Unless you're a Calvinist. It's not like the dog knows that he knows there's a ball in front of you. Nonetheless, he still knows. Or the young infant, right? Cognitive science tells us a lot about what infants know and how their beliefs and so forth develop. It's not like that infants know that they know that red objects don't go out of existence once they aren't being observed, right? They don't have sophisticated faculties and concepts and so forth, but yet they have knowledge.
Right, they know these things, but they don't know that they know.
That's right.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of reject that. I think at the end of the day, as long as the faculties, and that's how dogs and children know, right? Their faculties are just sort of naturally producing beliefs given certain things in the environment. And as long as their beliefs are the product of properly functioning cognitive faculties, aimed at truth, right? They're in the right environment. And there's one other more technical point that I didn't mention earlier. But the idea is that there's like a high objective probability, statistical probability, that the belief being produced will be true. And so, I mean, if these conditions are there when the belief is produced, that's to say the faculties are reliable at getting to truth, then I think that's enough. However, if you're like, no, but like, do we have good arguments, right, to get us to God? Well, then, yeah, you're sort of switching a little bit, and you're going maybe a classical or an evidentialist route. However, I do think that the Reformed epistemologist isn't, say, just completely without resources to put on his opponent or her opponent. And so Plantinga has developed a couple of arguments against naturalism. One is this idea that, hey, if you have to have properly functioning faculties in order to have knowledge, if naturalism is true, if atheism is true, maybe we can't really make sense of proper function. Maybe there is no proper function on naturalism. And if that's the case, and we have to have proper function to know, then if atheism is true, we can't know anything. But we do know things. And so, therefore, atheism is false, right? There's this other way, more popular. It's called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And the idea is that if someone believes that naturalism is true, that atheism is true, and they also affirm neo-Darwinian evolution, then they're going to, on reflection, they're going to have a defeater for trusting that their faculties are indeed reliable. This is because their cognitive faculties have come about, through this process of
survival,
random
mechanism.
genetic mutation, and Patricia Churchland says that our faculties are aimed at the I'm paraphrasing, at the four F's: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and reproducing. And so
the four F's.
yes, and so that if that's the case, why think our faculties are actually obtaining true beliefs, right? Just as long as they get our beliefs get us in the right place at the right time, or our faculties get us in the right place at the right time to survive, reproduce, feed, flee, etc., fight, then why think that they're actually producing true beliefs?
So to sort of summarize here, we could hold false beliefs which help us accomplish those evolutionary goals.
That's right.
And so the human brain hasn't been developed per se to develop true beliefs or even the faculty to know what's true, but rather to accomplish those goals. And thus, that view, the evolutionary view, devoid of a theistic approach to it, is self-defeating, and it's a defeater in terms of the argument that we really shouldn't believe this because on its base it doesn't make sense.
And even much more so with like really complex, right, philosophical, metaphysical, highly technical views. Like, why think our faculties then, if that's the story, are reliable when it relates to quantum mechanics or A versus B theory of time, or if
my head around that one,
or if God exists, yeah. So,
yeah. Okay, so for the folks in the video, they don't think God exists. On your view, if belief in God is, say, properly basic, what's going on with them? Why are they unable to grasp or comprehend the beautiful handiwork of the Creator?
Yeah, well, Plantinga talks about sin coming into the world and damaging our cognitive faculties, making our faculties not produce the belief as it ought, right? So maybe our faculties, while damaged, at least most of our faculties, right, most people in the world, are still sufficiently operating enough to where they can produce belief about God. Nonetheless, they're not working as they would have if sin wouldn't have entered into the world. Maybe if sin wouldn't have entered into the world, maybe we'd all believe in God, every one of us, as, say, we believe that other minds exist, right? So, I mean, there is that factor. Perhaps we're not in idealized conditions or an environment for which we were designed for. Maybe an environment that brainwashes people, or there's just constant destruction and bleakness. Maybe that's not the environment for which our sensus divinitatis was designed for, right? So, I mean, there are different explanations for this. Bit controversial. Kelly James Clark has an interesting video on YouTube. Encourage those who are interested to go and look at it. But if according to cognitive science, right, belief in God's natural to our faculties. So what do we make of atheism? Atheism is not natural to our faculties. And so there's a question about a link between atheism and those who are higher on the scale for autism. So autism sort of prevents the individual from understanding other minds, right? As one who has properly functioning faculties, I guess, would have a better time understanding, right? There's a connection between other minds and other people's thoughts, and this gets into social etiquette and all sorts of different things, right? Well, on average, it appears, again, not saying like a steadfast rule, but on average, there appears to be a link that those who are atheists tend to be higher on the scale for autism than theists. That's his point in the video. And so one of the connections here is that, well, hey, if you're having if you're more higher on the scale for autism, you're more likely to have a harder time understanding other minds. Well, what is God? God's a mind. And so there's been different postulations in reference to that correlation as well to explain that. So yeah, I mean, maybe it's, if sin wouldn't have entered the world, maybe we'd all be producing belief in God the way that maybe you and I produce, or maybe even better, right?
So the fellow, what was his name? Kelly James Clark?
Yeah.
Okay. His proposal, yes, controversial. It could also help explain other data that we know. For instance, it tends to be the case that atheists are more thoughtful about their beliefs, and maybe that's the case because there's just more introspection that's happening. So that could help explain some of the data. But now some of this is still controversial, and if you're listening to the program, you might think, oh, well, now I'm going to go talk to my atheist neighbor and say you're on the spectrum. You know, that is a very poor tactic for
yeah, and not true either. Right? The idea was on average.
Yes. So. Very poor tactic. So with the few minutes that we have left here, Tyler, I want to ask you, we've got these different methodologies. We have these different views on how it is that we come to form beliefs in God. But what would be sort of your, give us some of your advice, and it might vary on the context, for how we should approach our atheist, our agnostic neighbor, and how to talk to them about our belief that God exists.
Yeah, well, with love, right? God is love, and we're to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so seeing them as someone made in God's image and having great value and worth, someone who has rights and beliefs and emotions, seeing them as a person, seeing them how God sees them, and try to replicate great love for them just as God has great love for them. I guess that's the first part. While I'm not reformed, I really like Charles Spurgeon's quote where he says, before you go and try to talk to men about God, go and talk to God, about man, and be in great prayer for them. And I think that ideally, if you can talk to them in an environment like in nature or where there's great loving relationships, right? Some sort of really good environment, I think, for perhaps what their sensus divinitatis was designed for. I think that could be quite helpful. And then maybe either giving them arguments for God's existence or lovingly talk to them and say, well, hey, if God exists, it seems like we can know that he exists. Here's how, right? The story that we've been discussing today. But if atheism is true, it seems like we couldn't know that, and give one of the arguments suggested earlier, or maybe be a bit eclectic and utilize arguments, talk about reformed epistemology. And I think at the end of the day, it's really important that we get to the gospel. The gospel has power. The gospel is grace. The Spirit of God, no matter what we say, how we fail in our dialogue, our discussions, our coming up with arguments. At the end of the day, God can transform, repair the damage of our sensus divinitatis, right? Repair the damage that's been done from sin, and can testify through Scripture, through a preacher, the great truths of the gospel, to where the person just has strong inclinations to think that it's true. And so do apologetics, do it as best you can. At the end of the day, you pray for them greatly, and you try to share the gospel with them and let the Spirit work.
That's some great advice, and not just from one-on-one conversations, but Tyler, you've had some experience doing street evangelism, and hopping up on a soapbox and preaching to the crowds. Tell us what that experience was like. Yeah, so whenever there's lots of people around. You mean anywhere, like when you're on a train or? No, I don't do it on a train. I don't do it in places where they can't escape. But hey, if it's public, property, and get up and there's lots of people gathered and moving around, going to different stores or something, stand up and I'll either just start with the syllogism. And I think a lot of people are attracted to that because they've heard people get up and just be like, hell, fire, brimstone.
But it's really weird to see someone dressed slightly hipstery, right? Get
slightly,
up
Tyler,
and just start. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And going through each premise, all right. So I go that route, just start with syllogisms, or I go through a reformative epistemology route. If God exists, we can know that he exists and explain that. But if atheism is true, explain the other side. And I just start explaining these things. And then I say, so if God exists, would you be right with him? And then I talk about sin and how we suck as human beings often.
Yeah.
We mess up. And then bring the gospel. And throughout that, either people will raise objections. The best thing you can find is a heckler who will dialogue with you. Right? Because that's when all of a sudden your 3 people kind of looking at you turn into like 20 or 30 or 40 who are constantly engaged listening to dialogue. Dialogue is the key. Dialogue makes everyone attentive and listening. And it can be a really great ministry for those who I think utilize it rightly. Sadly, it hasn't been utilized, I think.
Yeah, that's true.
That's effectively.
Yeah, people get up and just say you're a sinner, and that doesn't.
That's right.
While that might be true, well, it is true, I should say. It's not necessarily an effective way for reaching people, given, say, their other beliefs.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Steven Crowder's table?
Yes.
Convince me otherwise.
So we're actually planning to go to a university next week and putting up a sign that says something like "atheism is self-defeating" or something. Prove me.
Yeah, prove me wrong,
or change my mind or something.
Yeah, that's what it is. Change my mind. Yeah. Nice. Good. Tyler, thank you so much for coming on our program today and enlightening us about these difficult questions that people might be having genuine doubts over. I know it's very tricky, and someone like yourself I know I've learned something just through this hour, so thank you.
I've really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and if you want to come on, maybe we'll just do an episode on Marvel, and we'll totally nerd out over that stuff.
Yeah, sounds good, sir.
Great. God bless you. Thank you.
You too, sir.
All right, well, that does it for our program today. On next week's program, we have John Peckham, and we're talking about why does God allow pain and suffering as we continue our Explore God series, asking some of these very important life questions that people are asking, the big questions of life. All right, so I'm grateful for the continued support that we have from our patrons and the partnerships that we have with our sponsors. And they are Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, and Fox Restoration. Thank you to our technical producer, Chris, for his masterful work. And if you want any good reason to financially support our program, do it for Chris. All right? That'd be a great reason. Thank you to our guest today, Dr. Tyler McNabb. If you want to learn more about him, you can go to hbu.edu, and we'll put up a link specifically on our website to his faculty page. You can see his research and learn more about the things that he's published on. But last, and certainly not least, and most of all, I want to thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.